Hello, if you are watching this recording, it means that you probably missed our Wednesday Bible study at 2 o'clock this Wednesday, September 16th, the year 2020. And I forgot to hit record while we gave that presentation. So I am making this recording now for those of you who missed it so that you don't miss out on any of the content that we've been studying. So you're ready for the next Bible study, which will not be next week because I will be away in a digital retreat, but will be Wednesday, the 30th of September. So 2 weeks from now, it will be when we have our next Bible study, and it will be on Genesis chapter 15. But this week, we're going to go over Genesis chapter 14 as a broad overview, and then we're going to focus hard on 17 through 24, and focus on this obscure character called Melchizedek. Melchizedek. Mysterious and intriguing. Chapter 14 is the most difficult chapter in Genesis to decipher. It comes out of nowhere and does not seem to help the Abram/Abraham narrative along in any important way. These incongruities make Genesis 14 at once puzzling and intriguing. P.J. Ells writes, chapter 14, as a most enigmatic chapter in the book of Genesis, seems at first glance to stand alone and without connection to any of the sources or strands of tradition found elsewhere in the book. It is apparently placed here because of the reference to Lot in verses 12 through 16, thus having it follow the Lot narrative in chapter 13. Margalith writes, as pointed out already by many scholars, the whole chapter in this nature is in the nature of a hero story or legend. Consequently, one should not expect it to be a well-constructed plot, but rather a badly cobbled medley of episodes dimly remembered from past traditions, which served as frame and background to an exploit ascribed to an ancestral hero, with echoes of memories of mighty conquerors from a legendary person, a paramyth. All this to say, if you read the chapter right after reading chapter 13, you might feel like the writing style has changed. You might feel like all of these characters are suddenly being introduced with no context and then they quickly leave the narrative. And you might feel that you could have just as easily skipped right on to chapter 15 and not have missed a whole lot in terms of the narrative. It would not really have interrupted the narrative very much. And you'd be right. And you wouldn't be the first to have noticed this. Much of chapter 14 tells of conflicts between warring kings. Many of these kings and their kingdoms are only mentioned in Genesis chapter 14, and historians know virtually nothing about them. Abram's nephew Lot gets pulled into the narrative in verse 12. Sodom's defeat and Lot's capture prompts Abram's intervention. He gathers 318 warriors. Why 318? I don't know. And defeats the 4 armies that have just defeated 5 armies. So the point is, Abram is a mighty warrior, which is a bit surprising because he never was portrayed as such before. Hybert writes from the Common English Bible Commentary, this portrait of Abram as the commander of an army is unusual and seems out of character in the context of the other traditions about him, which describe him only as the head of a family. At the same time, acting as Lot's protector is consistent with the surrounding narratives. You may remember he protected Lot back in chapter 12, bringing him with him to Egypt during time of famine. He gave him the first choice of land in chapter 13, and then later he will rescue him when Sodom and Gomorrah go up in smoke. Now to the text, beginning with verse 17 of chapter 14. Melchizedek. After his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shava, that is, the king's valley. This change of scenery is likely important. Before, they were slogging it out in a valley of destruction. So verse 10 of 14 reads, now the valley of Sodom, the valley that they were in, was full of bitumen pits, and as the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some fell into them, and the rest fled to the hill country. Now the king of Sodom and Lot find themselves on the other side of debacle and in the valley of a better sort of, the valley where a better sort of king resides. So they're on the other side of calamity, of violence, and now they're in this land called the Valley of the King, and we're about to meet the king who is there. The allure of the land and prosperity near and around Sodom had drawn Lot into its orbit. He chose that land, and then he gets caught up in the violence of that land. The pursuit of even more wealth and land has led to outright war on a grand scale, and Lot is drawn into the conflict. The land he had chosen is proving to come with unforeseen consequences, namely violence and loss of life. Verse 18, King Melchizedek of Salem brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. Melchizedek is a mysterious figure, writes Freinlein, mentioned elsewhere only in Psalm 110, verse 4, a royal psalm, and Hebrews 5 through 7, where the author interprets him in messianic terms. Melchizedek means my king is righteousness, or my king is righteous. It is to say, here is a king who pursues righteousness, or in fact is righteous. This king's North Star and guiding principles are the values of God. He is called a priest of the Most High God. That phrase in English, God Most High, is translated from the Hebrew El Elyon, which was a name for God who presides over a pantheon of gods, so the chief amongst all the lesser gods. This name for God predates Abram by some time and was used by other peoples outside of Israel and Canaan and also throughout the land as well. Salem means peace. So King Melchizedek, the righteous king, is the king of this place called peace. So they've left a land of violence for a land of peace. And here in this land of peace, the values are different. Here the king does not come at another king with a sword, like we had just been reading about earlier in the chapter, but rather sets a table before them. Bread is symbolic of God's provision and the wine of God's abundance. This is a lavish meal that the king sets. Verse 19 reads that he being Melchizedek, blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, maker of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." So here we have a foreign king, one presumably outside of the Abrahamic covenant, blessing Abram. Remember, Abram was told by Yahweh that he would be a blessing to all nations back in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 2. But as was the case back in Egypt in 12:10 through 20, Abram finds himself on the receiving end of blessing by way of a foreigner. It is unnerving to some to acknowledge that God works through, blesses by, and teaches through those outside of our nation, tribe, and religious circles. One could easily imagine Abram rejecting the blessing or offering a more magnanimous blessing in the name of Yahweh. And he does give a blessing. He returns a 1/10 of everything. Verse 12b reads, "And Abram gave him 1/10 of everything." So Abram blessed the one who has blessed him. What we see in the land of Salem, the land of peace, is the value system of Yahweh / God Most High in action. The king whose king is righteousness blesses the one who is meant to be a blessing to all nations. Then that one, Abram, blesses Melchizedek, the king of the Most High God, thus conferring blessing back to God's mediator and consequently back to God, the source of life. What we have here are cycles of blessing, of reciprocity, where blessings come back round as they are freely given by all. Also, in the giving of his tithe, Abram acknowledges the legitimacy of Melchizedek's authority. He sees that Melchizedek truly is a priest of God, though God by another name. He acknowledges that Melchizedek is a mediator between earth and the divine. Sorry, that was supposed to be the end of verse 20, not verse 12. That's a misprint. So that's the end of verse 12. Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. Verse 21. Then the king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself." And before I move on, call your attention to this picture here, this sort of strange picture. I like to choose pictures that are more representative of the peoples and times that these stories are about. And with this one, I just couldn't find any. They were all Eurocentric paintings. You see to the left, there's, I guess that may be the king of Sodom dressed in Greco-Roman military garb. You have this very odd crouching, mostly naked man to the bottom right. I have no idea what that is meant to signify. You have the poor fella above, who we take to be Melchizedek, carrying the bread on his back in a way that suggests he is encumbered by the burden. Then you have Melchizedek, who looks like some variant of Father Christmas. All this to say, I have no idea why this story has evoked so much art and art like this, but it's what I found predominantly. So that was an aside. Let's get back to the text. So the king of Sodom says, "Give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself," says this to Abram. The king of Sodom is still operating in the old paradigm, one that values looting, possessions, and the procurement of land. He does not understand the ways of Salem, or the ways of peace, a land where its king sets the dinner table and gives generously. Its king sets the dinner table and gives generously, not the servants. He expects Abram to be like-minded and keep the lion's share of the spoils of war. Feinlein writes in the New Interpreter's Bible Commentary, "The issue here is not simply whether Abram will take the spoils, but whether he will take Lot's goods and use them, and that of others, for gaining hegemony in Lot's land." In some sense, this discussion recapitulates chapter 13. Abram refuses an explicit opportunity to invest himself in Lot's land. You may remember chapter 13 was where Abram gave Lot the choice between two directions to go, which land to occupy, and Lot chooses the one that looks the best, and Abram takes the other one, trusting in Yahweh. And here seems to be another example where Abram chooses to not take the way that seems more profitable in the short term, and instead defer to trust and reliance on Yahweh. Verse 22, "But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have sworn to the Lord," that English word Lord is from the Hebrew Yahweh, then God Most High. "I have sworn to Yahweh El Elyon." He combines the two names, the name that Melchizedek has and then the one that he holds. And he names this God, maker of heaven and earth, "that I would not take a thread or sandal thong or anything that is yours, so that you might not say, I have made Abram rich. I will take nothing but what the young men have eaten, and share of the men who went with me, Ener, Eshcol, and Mamre. Let them take their share." So here, Abram chooses to be made rich by way of his faithfulness to Yahweh and the covenantal relationship he has with Yahweh. He will not participate in Sodom's economy or ways of being. Also, this passage is sometimes mentioned by Jews and Christians who participate in interfaith dialogue with other faith groups. Notice Abram names his God, Yahweh, and El Elyon as one and the same. In so doing, Abram is acknowledging the movement of the one God through a priest who has no connection to him or his offspring, that is, Israel. This points to a connection to the divine that transcends our creeds, customs, scriptures, and traditions. And this is exactly what we might expect to discover if God is in fact God of all creation and peoples. So I'll leave you with the few takeaways in leaving. This chapter provides one teaching moment from the onset by way of its placement. I mentioned this at the very beginning when I talked about how this was a difficult chapter to decipher or to work through, the most difficult in Genesis chapter 14. And it gives you an excellent opportunity to see how the Torah is compiled, or to learn something about that. If you feel as though it interrupts the narrative, you are not the first to feel this way. In fact, nearly all biblical scholars acknowledge this. Here, we can more easily see the work of the redactor or redactors, those that compiled the Torah. You can see their work at play, weaving the story together as seamlessly as possible. However, keeping the narrative seamless was not always possible. Some of the materials they were working with were more difficult to place and did not always fit the themes, motifs, and writing styles of the majority of the writings that comprise the Torah. Chapter 14 serves as an excellent example of a text that was probably somewhat difficult to place. And you could read 13 and go straight to 15, and it wouldn't impact the story of Abram/Abraham in any drastic way. Moving on, next point. We see in this chapter the tension between the ways of warring nations and the ways of the king of Salem. In Salem, the king prepares a meal for his guests, and not just any meal. Bread is simple enough, but wine was the drink of good times, of abundance and prosperity. To set such a table is to elevate the guest to high status. The king of Sodom, by contrast, is sitting at the table thinking about how best to divide the spoils of war. Abram chooses to forego what has been acquired by way of violence and instead accepts the gift of bread and wine given him in the land of peace by its king. What's more, Abram pays back the king for his generosity, blessing as he was blessed. So you see the cycles of reciprocity, which will always be the case in the land of peace. This story has long intrigued me. Since my childhood, this story has intrigued me. A priest of the Most High God, and a king to boot, is introduced out of nowhere and with no backstory, and seems to have this in with God apart from the Abrahamic covenant. And then he just steps out of the narrative. He, too, is a conduit of the divine, just as Abraham is meant to be. And he, too, has made righteous living his goal, and as a king, no doubt rules in light of these values. And then he just drifts off into the sunset, and we don't read any more about him in the Torah. Just some references in the book, a reference in the book of Psalm and some of the apocryphal works, and then in Hebrews chapters 5 through 7. While it may be troubling for some to discover God working outside of supposed official channels, for me, it is greatly comforting. In this story, Abraham discovers a priest. First time a priesthood is mentioned, by the way, in the Torah. It's Melchizedek. We don't even know of priestly orders, and then you have this priest of God Most High. Abram discovers a priest whose connection to God is very strong. Melchizedek is not a part of the Abrahamic covenant, nor will he be a part of Abram's story going forward. He stands nearly outside of the narrative. It is as if to suggest that there are stories about God in relation to others, apart from our own, of which we have very little to do with. They may even have a different name for God, but nonetheless, God's ways and values are being brought into the world by way of them. No faith community or religion holds the monopoly on God. Melchizedek personified priestly and kingly roles. Last point. He was a conduit to the divine and the ruler of a people. Throughout Israel's history, the roles of priest and king would remain separate, but they bore a hope that one day a priestly king of the order of Melchizedek would rule over Israel, one who led righteously. You can read about the description of this kind of king in Psalm 110. Then in the book of Hebrews, the Christian writer would make the case that Jesus was a priest in the order of Melchizedek, that he too was a priest of an order that transcends all other orders. That wraps up this week's Bible study. If you have any questions, you might write to me. My email address is heath@indyncc.org. And if you're interested in tuning in next week, remember we are not having class next week, but on the 30th of September, Wednesday the 30th at 2 o'clock p.m. And we look forward to perhaps seeing you then. God bless and have a wonderful rest of your day.